The haunting tales of the toolbox and VHS tape, unsettling yard sale mysteries. I'm a 31-year-old insurance agent, and after long weeks of mind-numbing work, I find solace in an odd hobby, exploring yard sales. It almost feels like modern-day treasure hunting, rooting through lost and forgotten items. But what began as a relaxing hobby ended with me ensnared in a waking nightmare. Little did I know that one impulsive morning stop would unravel my sense of safety piece by piece. It was a crisp Saturday morning that seemed deceptively harmless. I followed a sign for a modest yard sale, and amongst a smattering of knickknacks, a small rusty red toolbox caught my eye. The chipped paint and rugged look reminded me of my grandfather's garage. The man running the sale offered it for $10. An unremarkable purchase, or so I thought. The box sat untouched in my garage for a week before my life began spiraling into a psychological horror. It started with a ring at my doorbell. Standing on the porch was a wiry man in his late 40s, his weathered face and piercing eyes casting unsettling energy into the air. "That toolbox," he said in a gravelly whisper, leaning closer. "It's mine." My stomach turned as I involuntarily stepped back. His tone wasn't pleading, it was demanding. Before departing, he delivered a chilling promise. "I'll be back." The following days were plagued by the man's increasingly aggressive visits. He banged on the door at all hours, shouting, demanding I return what didn't belong to me. His desperation bordered on madness. One night I heard the door creak. He had tried the handle. Now I knew this ordeal wasn't about ownership, it was malicious. When he eventually attempted to force his way in, I made the dreaded 911 call. The arrival of the police provided fleeting safety, but something about the toolbox gnawed at me. In the quiet of the same night, I pried open the bottom of the toolbox only to discover its dark underbelly, a false panel containing small plastic bags packed with a white powdery substance. Drugs. What I unearthed was not antiques, it was chaos in disguise. I handed the stash to the police, hoping the nightmare would end, but the torment only intensified. Days later, I returned home late to an ominous sight. My front door hanging open, its lock destroyed. Fear gripped me as I crossed the shattered threshold. Inside, my living room lay in utter disarray. Footsteps rushed down the hallway just as I caught sight of two men bolting out the back door. I'd become a pawn in something much darker than I bargained for. They weren't trying to recover heirlooms. They were hiding something sinister. My property, my life, became staged for horrors far beyond my mundane job. The men disappeared that night, but the feeling of being watched never left. Now cameras line my home, as paranoia confines me to sleepless nights and jumpy glances over my shoulder. Sometimes, while staring out the window, I wonder if he still watches, waiting to claim what he lost. Technology, they say, moves forward, but sometimes looking back can feel comforting. On weekends, I indulge in that nostalgia. Clunky VHS tapes, grainy rewinds, and retro discoveries. At a yard sale not far from home, I spotted a cardboard box filled with old classics. Buried at its bottom was something peculiar, an unmarked black tape drenched in mystery. Of course, I had to have it. That night, curiosity pulled me toward the unknown depths recorded on that unassuming tape. I popped it into my vintage VCR. With a soft click, static overtook the screen before transitioning into grainy footage of a family, a father, mother, and two children, lounging in a warmly lit living room. Despite its mundane charm, dread seeped in the longer I stared. The layout, the arrangement, I couldn't shake the feeling. This was familiar. Then it hit me. The room was my living room. Every detail mirrored the space I currently lived in. The alcove where my bookshelf stood, the chipped fireplace mantel. But these strangers were decades removed from my arrival. My unease grew when, in the tape, the atmosphere changed. A child pointed toward what I knew to be the hallway, only for the mother to hush him urgently, drawing him close. Shadows began to move unnaturally against the far wall, shapes that neither flickered like candlelight nor belonged to the family. Whispers rose from the silence, soft at first, then louder, like they encircled the room. Frightened, I paused the tape, but the sense of being watched didn't pause with it. The unanswered questions grew heavier. The sleeve's adhesive had long since peeled, yet no hint of any recorded label remained. Had someone left this video as a warning, or was it something worse, a remnant of what happened here long before I arrived? In daylight, I dared to revisit the footage. Determined to make sense of it, I pressed play. The tape resumed, the family now huddled together in unmistakable fear. The father stood, his frame blocking a doorway, but he wasn't looking out. It was as though he was barring entrance to something lurking inside. My breath caught as the whispers swirled louder. Furniture creaked, though the family remained still. Then, one by one, the children's toys slid toward the hallway on invisible strings. The sound of footsteps thudded off-screen without the presence of feet to make them. The static consumed the screen, erased their cries, and just like that the tape turned black forever. My mind grasped for reason. A prank, perhaps? Footage staged to frighten me. But the palpable terror etched on the mother's face was too genuine to dismiss. Had something followed me into this home? I couldn't rid myself of the gnawing thought. The tape wasn't a warning. It was a curse. As the night stretched onward, unexplained creaks began crawling back into my home. Sleepless hours passed, my back pressed against the headboard, waiting for signs of footsteps. But as morning came, daytime only offered smothering rationalizations. My mind had played tricks. Then, the final horror materialized the next night. That strange black tape disappeared, vanished, even though I'd hidden it away in a drawer near my room. For weeks, unexplained phenomena hounded me, flickering lights, strange bangs from nowhere, and whispers that didn't belong to me. I left that house soon after. Wherever it is, I know that tape remains out there, maybe spinning through another VCR, maybe being found by someone else. Both stories bring a bone-chilling reminder of how ordinary things, purchased with blissful ignorance, can harbor unimaginable horrors. For the next time you see a yard sale sign on an idle morning, remember, some items hold more than memories. They hold ghosts, lives unfinished, and chills ready to crawl into yours. Story 3. The Mirror. Yard sales have always been a kind of therapy for me. There's something oddly satisfying about rummaging through old items, finding that one hidden gem and imagining the story behind it. They give me a break from the intensity of my job and a chance to unwind. One Saturday morning, I grabbed my coffee, hopped in my car, and drove to a nearby neighborhood hosting a community-wide yard sale. The streets were crowded with people, tables overflowing with everything from dusty books to vintage knickknacks. I parked near a quiet cul-de-sac where a lone yard sale was set up under a massive oak tree. The sign caught my attention, antiques and vintage finds. I strolled over, taking my time to browse through the collection. There were old cameras, ornate silverware sets, and even a vintage typewriter. But what caught my eye was a tall mirror leaning against the side of the house. Its frame was gilded gold, carved with intricate vines and flowers. Though it showed signs of wear, the glass was slightly warped, giving it that old-fashioned charm that instantly drew me in. I imagined it hanging in my living room, catching the afternoon sunlight. As I studied the mirror, the vendor, a wiry man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, walked over. "Admiring the mirror?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. "It's beautiful," I replied, running my fingers over the frame. "How much?" He hesitated, his hand resting protectively on the mirror's edge. "It's special," he said. "Been in my family for generations. Are you sure it's what you're looking for?" His reluctance caught me off guard. Most vendors I'd encountered were eager to sell, but he seemed almost possessive. "I'm sure," I said, smiling. "It would look perfect in my living room." He stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but it's heavy. Let me deliver it to your house. It's no trouble." His insistence gave me a bad feeling. I could have easily fit the mirror in my car, but I didn't want to be rude. Against my better judgment, I agreed and gave him my address. A couple of hours later, his old pickup truck pulled into my driveway. I met him outside, planning to help carry the mirror in, but he waved me off. "I've got it," he said, carefully unloading it and bringing it inside. He placed it against the wall in my living room and stood back, admiring his work. "It looks good here," he said, his tone almost reverent. "Take care of it." "Thank you," I replied, but he lingered, his eyes scanning the room. It felt intrusive, like he was memorizing every detail. Finally, he left, and I locked the door behind him, feeling a strange sense of relief. That evening, I sat on the couch, admiring the mirror in its new spot. It was as stunning as I'd imagined, its golden frame catching the glow of the lamp. But as the night wore on, a faint unease crept in. I told myself it was just my overactive imagination, and went to bed. The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab the mail, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was an old blue sedan with tinted windows. I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon when it was still there. I glanced over, but I couldn't see who was inside. Shrugging it off, I went back inside. That evening, as I closed the curtains, I peeked outside again. The sedan was still parked there. This time I could make out the outline of a man sitting behind the wheel. My chest tightened when I realized it was the vendor from the yard sale. Why would he be parked outside my house? Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was visiting someone. But as the days passed, the sedan remained a constant presence, parked in the same spot for hours at a time. By the fourth day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I looked out the window and saw the sedan parked closer, this time at the curb, right in front of my house. My chest tightened as I saw the man sitting in the driver's seat, staring directly at my house. I decided to confront him. I stepped out onto my porch, my heart pounding as I crossed the yard. As soon as I reached the sidewalk, he started the car and drove off. I stood there for a moment, my hands trembling. Was I overreacting? Maybe he had a perfectly innocent reason for being there. That night, I couldn't sleep. The slightest noise in the house made me jump, and the mirror, once a beautiful addition to my home, now gave me the creeps. I moved it into the garage, covering it with an old sheet. The next evening, I was sitting in the living room when headlights flooded the front yard. I peeked through the curtains and saw the sedan parked in my driveway. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the man step out of the car and start walking toward the house. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining the situation as I locked the doors and windows. The man was pacing along the sidewalk, occasionally looking up at the windows. He didn't try to enter, but his presence was enough to chill me to the bone. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The man jumped back into his car and sped off, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, I described him, provided the car's plate number, and explained everything that had happened. The officer assured me they'd patrol the area and try to track him down. The man never returned, but I've never been able to forget it. I couldn't stop feeling paranoid, checking every lock and looking over my shoulder constantly. Eventually, I brought the mirror back up to the living room, hoping that seeing it in the light of day might help me reclaim some sense of normalcy. But even now, it doesn't feel like it's really mine. There's something about it, a heaviness, like it still belongs to him somehow. I haven't decided if I'm going to keep it or sell it, but for now, it just sits there. A quiet reminder of how easily something seemingly harmless can leave its shadow. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were. Was he just an eccentric man who became fixated on me? Or was there something darker at play? All I know is that I've stopped going to yard sales. And every time I see a car parked too long outside my house, I feel a pang of dread. Story 4, The Rocking Chair. I've always loved vintage furniture, the wear and tear, the little imperfections. They give each piece a unique story to tell. So when I saw that vintage rocking chair at a yard sale, I knew I couldn't pass it up. It was charming in a way only old furniture can be. The dark wood was etched with delicate carvings of vines and leaves, and though the seat had a few scratches, it looked sturdy. I could already picture it in my living room, tucked into the corner by the window. "How much for the chair?" I asked, running my hand along the armrest. The woman running the sale barely looked at me as she muttered, $20. It was a steal, but her tone gave me pause. She seemed eager to get rid of it. "It's an antique, right?" I pressed, curious about its history. "It's old," she said with a shrug. "You want it or not?" Her dismissive attitude should have been a red flag, but I chalked it up to her just wanting to clear out her clutter. I handed her the 20, loaded the chair into my car, and drove home, excited to find the perfect spot for it. The chair fit perfectly by the bay window. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging my living room around it, placing a soft throw blanket over the back and a small rug underneath. By the time I was done, it looked like it had always been there. That evening, I sat in the chair for the first time with a book and a cup of tea. The wood creaked softly under my weight, the gentle rocking motion oddly soothing. Around 11 p.m., I turned off the lights and headed to bed. As I lay there in the dark, I heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from the living room. It was rhythmic, like someone gently rocking back and forth in the chair. I sat up, listening. The sound continued for a few moments before stopping. It's just the wood settling, I told myself, though my heart was racing. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but the sound stayed with me. The creaking became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes it was faint, other times louder, as if someone were pushing the chair harder. I started avoiding the living room at night, opting to stay in my bedroom with the door closed. One morning I walked into the living room and froze. The chair was slightly out of place, angled toward the window. Maybe I bumped it, I thought, though I knew that wasn't true. I'd been careful not to touch it when I vacuumed the day before, and I lived alone. There was no one else who could have moved it. I shoved the chair back into place and went about my day, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. One night I decided to test the chair. After dinner I sat in it for a while, rocking gently, trying to see if there was something mechanical about the movement or sound. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Before going to bed, I took a small piece of tape and placed it under one of the chair's legs, marking its position. If it moved again, I'd know for sure. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the loudest creaking yet. It was violent, the sound of wood straining as the chair rocked back and forth with force. I threw on my robe and ran into the living room. The chair was rocking furiously, the throw blanket draped over its back slipping to the floor. "Stop it!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure who or what I was yelling at. The chair stopped abruptly, the room falling into eerie silence. My eyes darted to the tape mark. The chair had moved several inches off its original spot. That was the first time I truly felt afraid. The next evening, as I was locking up for the night, I heard something new, a faint whisper, low and unintelligible, coming from the living room. I inched closer to the doorway, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the chair. "Who's there?" I whispered. The whispering stopped. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and called my friend Anna. "I need you to come over," I said, fighting to maintain a calm tone. Anna arrived 20 minutes later, rolling her eyes when I told her about the chair. "You're just hearing things," she said, plopping down on the couch. But then the creaking started again. Anna froze, her eyes widening as she stared at the chair. "Okay," she whispered, "that's not normal." The final straw came 2 nights later. I decided to sleep in the living room, thinking maybe my presence would keep the chair from moving. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a loud bang. The chair was rocking violently, slamming against the wall with each swing. The throw blanket had fallen to the floor. I jumped up, backing away as the chair continued its relentless movement. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was safely in my car. The next morning, I dragged the chair out to the curb, leaving a sign that simply read, "Free." I didn't care who took it. I just wanted it gone. By the time I checked again, the chair was gone. But I didn't feel relieved. The living room felt empty, but not in a comforting way. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something into my home with that chair. Now, whenever I see a piece of vintage furniture, I hesitate. There's no way to know what history it carries, or what might be attached to it. And as much as I love the charm of old furniture, I've learned one thing: some treasures aren't worth the trouble they